So welcome everybody to this webinar, A Climate of Insecurity, How the West Has Militarized and Impoverished the African Continent. So just very briefly, we'll have an amazing moderator today, Tamara Lorincz. She is a member of WILPF Canada, and she's also our recently appointed new convener of the International Environment Working Group of WILPF. So she will be guiding us through this event today. And then we'll also have four amazing panelists with us today, Abayomi, Edwig, Mpiwa, and Jasmine. And they will speak about the different ways that the West has militarized the African continent, but they will also share suggestions and approaches to address these huge challenges. So you will have an opportunity at the end to ask questions. Hopefully we will have around 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. And before I hand over to my colleague Tamara, I just briefly wanted to introduce to you the organization that is hosting this event today, which is the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, WILPF. So WILPF is the oldest feminist and women's peace organization in the world. It's over 100 years old and was founded in the midst of World War I, when over 1,000 women from 12 countries met in the Netherlands. And it was back then when they created WILPF with a goal to develop mediation strategies to end the war and to ultimately eradicate the root causes of war. Today, we have two main offices in Geneva and New York, out of which WILPF's Secretariat is working. And beyond that, we have 41 sections and 5 groups across Africa, the Americas, South Asia, Asia Pacific, Europe, and the MENA region, where all of us are working for a world of permanent peace that's built on the foundations of freedom, justice, nonviolence, human rights, and equality for all. And as part of this vision, and over 2 decades ago, WILPF has set up the Environment Working Group. And I'm now very glad to hand over to Tamara, who, as I mentioned before, is the convener of the International Environment Working Group, member of WILPF Canada, and she'll be moderating this event today. Thank you so much.
Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm so glad you're joining us today. I'm speaking to you from Waterloo, Ontario. This is traditional territory of the Six Nations across the country that is now called Canada. For over 150 years, Indigenous land has been stolen, stripped of its natural resources, militarized, and contaminated. And this violent settler colonial system has evolved into a rapacious capitalist neocolonialism and militarism that is destroying the climate and biosphere, something that we really need to confront. And these are the themes of today's webinar that has been organized by WILPF International's Environment Working Group. It is made up of members from our sections around the world. Our group was established over 3 years ago to support WILPF's advocacy and activism for the environment and climate. We raise awareness about the adverse impacts of militarism, war, and armed conflict on people and the planet. And we look at the gender dimensions, and we seek out feminist peace solutions. Our working group meets every month, and we have an email discussion group and a webpage on wilpf.org website, and we welcome new members. Besides organizing webinars like this, we also do research and publish reports and articles, and we attend UN conferences. Our members can get accreditation through WILPF. Last spring, we had a delegation go to Stockholm +50, and next month, we are sending a delegation of 10 members to the Climate Summit, the Conference of the Parties, COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. The messages that we are going to be bringing to COP27 are the urgent need to demilitarize and decolonize to decarbonize, to reduce military spending and reallocate to climate financing, that there is no climate justice without peace, and that we need global cooperation, an ethic of care, and women-led climate solutions to avert catastrophic climate change. In the lead up to COP27, we have been educating ourselves and holding webinars. This past August, we held our first webinar on the climate impacts on the African continent and what women are trying to do to deal with it. And this webinar featured our WILPF African sisters, and the recording of this webinar can be found on our WILPF International Facebook page. Today's webinar is looking more closely at the intersections between militarism, extractivism, and the climate crisis on the African continent. And we are holding this webinar in solidarity with Black Alliance for Peace's Month of Action to shut down AFRICOM. I'm now going to share some slides with you, so I'll just bring it up now. So I'll begin by telling you the motivation for this webinar and provide a crucial example. So COP27 is happening in Egypt. Egypt's neighbor on the west is Libya. In 2011, NATO launched a military intervention to force Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi out. It was Canada, my country, that led the NATO bombing of Libya. For over 7 months, NATO's fossil fuel-powered fighter jets dropped 20,000 bombs, and its diesel-powered warships gunned the country. This bombing severely damaged civilian infrastructure, and it wrecked the great man-made river aquifer system, which is a source of 70% of Libya's water. After the bombing, the Canadian Air Force revealed that its fighter jets consumed 14,000 pounds of fuel, and the Canadian lieutenant that oversaw the operation retired and joined Lockheed Martin, the world's largest American weapons manufacturer. NATO's military operation in Libya led to the killing of Gaddafi and severely destabilized the country, causing a humanitarian and refugee crisis that led to waves of African migrants crossing and drowning in the Mediterranean Sea. After a decade, there is still chaos in Libya, and the country is not able to deal with the social unrest, much less with the climate-induced extreme weather events from severe sandstorms, droughts, heat waves, and crop failure. Yet Libya was one of the wealthiest countries in Africa with great oil and gas resources, and it was able to provide free healthcare and education to its people, and it was one of the leading countries in the African Union. Gaddafi was a Pan-Africanist, and he did not want Western colonialism and capitalism on the continent. Now Libya is in crisis from political instability and worsening climate change. US AFRICOM, that was established 14 years ago this month, in 2008, has many military bases across the continent, and the US has signed many agreements with African countries for so-called security sector reform and to supply natural resources. This is the way the US has been militarizing the continent. Look carefully at this slide. What AFRICOM says that it does. It does military exercises. Other NATO countries like France and my country, Canada, participate in these exercises. The other thing that US AFRICOM does is airstrikes. It has been bombing Somalia and Libya for many years. In June, these are the airstrikes. In June at the NATO summit in Madrid, the US-led military alliance launched its new strategic concept. For the first time, NATO has made Africa a strategic priority. This is very troubling and ominous. What NATO and AFRICOM has caused on the continent is more coups and more chaos. Nick Turse, an American investigative journalist, has done excellent extensive reporting on AFRICOM and NATO on the continent, and I encourage you to follow his work. More information about this Western militarism through AFRICOM and NATO can be found in this 2021 report from Tricontinental Institute entitled Defending Our Sovereignty, US Military Bases in Africa and the Future of African Unity. This militarism from NATO and AFRICOM paves the way for easier Western extraction the mining and looting of African resources. I will close by sharing the study with you done in 2016 by the UK War on Want. It's entitled The New Colonialism, Britain's Scramble for Africa's Energy. As well, this year, there have been many articles in Canadian Dimension about pernicious Canadian mining operations in Tanzania, Burkina Faso, South Africa, Congo, and many other African countries. Finally, I want to bring to your attention our first speaker's very important article. Africa remains the center of the 21st century Cold War. This is the crucial context that we must bear in mind as we head to Egypt for COP27. If we are serious about averting catastrophic climate change on the African continent and in the world, it is imperative that we call for AFRICOM and NATO to get out of Africa, that we call for Western militarism and extractivism to end on the continent, and that we call for reparations and loss and damage. There is no peace. Without peace, there is no climate justice. Without peace, there is no climate justice. So now let me introduce our first speaker. I'm so pleased that Abayomi Ezekwe is with us today. He is the editor of Pan-African Newswire, an electronic press agency that was founded in 1998. He has worked for decades in solidarity with liberation movements and progressive governments on the African continent and in the Caribbean. Abayomi is a graduate of Wayne State University in Detroit, where he earned an undergraduate and graduate degrees in political science and educational and administrative studies. He is the co-founder of several Detroit area organizations that are working to stop police brutality and end evictions. In the 1990s, Abayomi conducted field research in South African countries like Namibia and Lesotho. He is the author of numerous articles, and his writings have been published in many African news outlets like Tanzania Citizen, Zimbabwe Herald, Malawi Nation, Southern Times in Namibia, among many others. He has also written and published pamphlets such as What You Should Know About the Hidden War in Congo, Past and Present, Africa and Imperialism, and US Hands Off of Libya. In 2016, Abayomi published a book entitled Pan-Africanism, Gender Emancipation, and the Meaning of Socialist Development, Revisiting the Role of Women in Nkrumah's Ghana. Abayomi, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Tamara, and I want to extend my appreciation to the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. It's a very important organization historically. If we look back at the developments leading up to World War I, during the late 19th century and early 20th century, we see similarities to what is happening today on the international scene. My comments today will largely focus on the question of COP27 and the imperatives for a new, renewed African security framework. Obviously, the security framework that has been imposed by the legacy of enslavement, colonialism, and neo-colonialism, and of course, the refocused efforts on the part of the Pentagon, NATO, the French Foreign Legion on the African continent has been detrimental to the long-term sustainable peace and economic development of the continent. During the month of November, the North African state of Egypt will be the scene of the United Nations Climate Conference known as COP27. This conference of world leaders and non-governmental organizations are convening at a time when the very future of the international security framework is at stake. The Russian military intervention in neighboring Ukraine has its origins in the collapse of the former Soviet Union and the foreign policy orientation of the United States and its allies within the United Kingdom, the European Union, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization for over the last 3 decades. Rather than shift the thrust of international relations towards sustainable peace and development, successive US administrations from both ruling class parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, have consistently engaged in acts of destabilization and regime change. Events in Ukraine, for example, during February of 2014, when the administration of former President Barack Obama engineered the overthrow of the government of President Viktor Yanukovych and installed a right-wing regime, which utilized the armed elements within the fascist movement inside the country. This, of course, has served to destabilize all of Eastern Europe. This unilateral approach to foreign relations by Washington has created instability in Ukraine. It has heightened tensions between Kiev and Moscow. Russian-speaking communities in Ukraine have been subjected to national discrimination and state-sponsored ethnic violence. The regions of Donbass have been shelled on a daily basis for the last 8.5 years. Now, Biden's foreign policy orientation towards Eastern Europe, the Asia Pacific, Africa, and Latin America is geared towards reinforcing US global hegemony. A controversial bill labeled as the Countering Russian Malign Influence in Africa has been rejected by the 55-member African Union organization, which represents 1.4 billion people living on the continent. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, during his mid-September official visit to the White House, remained adamant about the negative consequences if such legislation was made into an instrument of US foreign policy. This bill would be tantamount to imposing an economic blockade on the entire African continent. The enactment of this measure would be reminiscent of the US embargo against the Socialist Republic of Cuba, and this has been done for more than 6 decades. The failure of the Biden administration to allow a diplomatic resolution to the war in Ukraine has created havoc within international markets. Inflation has negatively impacted working and impoverished peoples in the industrial and underdeveloped geopolitical regions, as resources needed to maintain a decent life are becoming even more elusive. Although the burgeoning energy crisis affecting the European Union countries, along with the United States and Canada, is being blamed on the Russian President Vladimir Putin, within corporate media networks, there is no analysis of the impact of runaway military spending engineered by Washington's international war drive. The US spends more on defense than any other country in the world, than all other countries in the world combined. With the priorities being placed on the production, distribution, and utilization of weaponry, the peoples of the global South are becoming imperiled by the ongoing internal and external warfare in Africa and other parts of the globe. This emphasis on defense spending is inextricably linked to climate change and its concomitant impact on populations who are dislocated, injured, and killed by the extreme weather events occurring from the southeast regions of the United States, where we saw the Hurricane Ian over the last week do tremendous amounts of damage in the United States, to East Africa, where we find drought and near famine conditions, and in South Asia, where there have been problems associated with flooding in Pakistan and also power outages in Bangladesh. At the same time as the COP27 gathering in Egypt, increasing threats of a wider conventional war, which ultimately could ignite a nuclear exchange between Moscow and Washington, poses an extreme impediment to reaching the goals set out by the Paris agreements many years ago. Obviously, the Biden administration's foreign policy is a reflection of a deeper malady within the world capitalist system. As regional entities such as the Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa Summit, BRICS, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, the Non-Aligned Movement, which remains in operation since its founding members met in a series of conferences from the 1955 Bandung, Indonesia meeting, which culminated in a permanent organization in Belgrade in the former Yugoslavia in 1961, the Africa-South America Summit, the African Union, among other regional organizations, represents a major thrust towards multipolarity. In the 21st century, the unilateralism of Washington is being rejected by billions across the globe. I would like to move on and make two additional points in my presentation. In a real sense, the instability in West Africa and the role of the Pentagon and NATO are crucial to solving the current problems that we are facing now on an international scale. Since the advent of the US Africa Command, AFRICOM, in 2008, the security situation in various regions of the African continent has grown substantially worse. There was the bombing of Libya and the assassination of its leader, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, some 11 years ago. This was the first major military project by AFRICOM, working in collaboration with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and its allies. Libya today is the source of much of the instability in North and West Africa. Western imperialist governments, which led the campaign to destroy Libya, have never taken any responsibility related to its disastrous consequences. Sectional violence spread after the Libya war of genocide. This occurred in a major way beginning in 2012. Armed groupings based upon sectional and religious approaches to national politics began to attack state institutions and civilian communities. Some of the most impoverished and marginalized people have suffered from the escalation of violence in North and West Africa. Mali became the first country to experience, yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Could I just ask you to speak a bit slower for the interpreters? That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mali became the first country to experience the fallout from the Pentagon-NATO war against the Jihadiyya in Libya. Several armed groups emerged in Mali, claiming the right to establish separate governments and spheres of influence. Who is really behind the emergence of these Islamic rebel groups operating in Mali, Burkina Faso, the Cameroon, Niger, Chad, Nigeria, among other states? The origins of these groupings have been attributed to several factors. Some suggest that the class character of governments within numerous West African states impede the creation of a democratic society. Others claim that the ruling circles are geared towards foreign-based multinational corporations and investment banks, leaving the majority of working people exploited and without the necessary resources to build independent lives. Nonetheless, in various sections of the anti-war, anti-imperialist, and social justice movements, there have been assertions that the so-called Islamist organizations associated with the existing rebel insurgencies were indeed funded and armed by the imperialist governments themselves. This in part explains the burgeoning anti-French and anti-US sentiment in many of the former colonies and now neo-colonies of Paris and Washington. Developments in Burkina Faso during the weekend of September 30th through October 2nd was a reflection of the rising tensions between Ouagadougou and Paris. Now, in concluding, I would just like to touch on some of the possible solutions in a general sense to the crisis in which we are facing at this present conjuncture. In evaluating the current parallels involving neocolonialism, climate change, Western military interventions, and domestic internecine conflicts, which have regional implications, it will require the organization and the mobilization of the 1.4 billion people on the African continent, along with their allies within the broader international community. These problems facing the continent must be resolved by the majority populations composed of workers, farmers, and young people. An expanding presence of Pentagon, French Foreign Legion, and NATO allied forces in West Africa and other regions of the continent has to be confronted by governments political parties, and mass organizations. Within the Western countries, the social justice formations, the trade unions, and organizations of the nationally oppressed, along with the revived peace movement, have an important role to play in not only transforming their own societies, it remains essential that these tendencies act in solidarity with the progressive governments and popular organizations operating within the global South. The upcoming summit in Egypt will provide a platform for the global community, both those inside and outside of state structures, to intervene in the ongoing debates over the future of the environment and its relationship to sustainable peace, development, and security. Climate researchers and activists have warned that the time is running out for the implementation of bold, decisive, and binding measures aimed at ending the environmental crisis. There is no alternative to this approach, since the failure to take action will ultimately lead to the destruction of human society and nature as they are known over the last untold millenniums. Let us utilize this period of crisis to move forward towards a world guided by peace and social justice, as opposed to exploitation and imperialist war. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abayomi, for that important presentation. And your point about military spending and armed conflict impeding progress on climate change, the Paris Agreement, is crucial. And you're absolutely right that we need a stronger peace movement that is based on justice and that is transnational. So thank you so much for that, Abayomi. Our next speaker is Edwick Madzimure. She is a member of WILPF and the founding director of WILPF Zimbabwe section. She is a development practitioner with a unique background in rural livelihoods and climate change vulnerabilities. Edwick also engages on humanitarian disarmament activism at the grassroots and national levels. She is on a mission to transform communities to better include youth and women in the development processes. This past spring, Edwick represented WILPF at Stockholm Plus 50, and in August, Edwick was one of our speakers on our webinar on the gender dimensions of climate change and the solutions needed in Zimbabwe. And Edwick is going to be on our WILPF delegation to COP27 next month. Take it away, Edwick. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamara. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you so much. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be sharing my video because my internet is very weak. There is no electricity. My presentation is focused on the nexus between the resources that are in Africa, militarism, and the climate crisis. Next slide. The presence of natural resources in Africa has proved to be a case than a blessing for most African countries. Resources have led to a lot of internal violent conflicts. Local people bear the brunt of the availability of natural resources in their vicinity. It's either they are displaced to pave way for foreign investors, or they are forced to migrate to safer areas due to violent conflicts that are caused by groups fighting for control over resources and access. Evidence from Angola, Sierra Leone, and DRC show that natural resources are being used to fuel conflicts through the use of the revenue to supply the military and rebels with their needs on the war front. While resources are the main cause of conflict in Africa, the resources are feeding the militarized political economies of the global north and the Global South. Next slide, please. Natural resources that are being looted from Africa, and the states are also getting military equipment in return. In southern Sudan, revenue from oil is being used to fuel militias. A small clique continues to get richer, while the majority of the South Sudanese suffer or flee from their home states. Numerous private companies have provided support to security forces in South Sudan in form of supplying and transporting weapons, troops, and other goods, thus profiteering from the war. In Sierra Leone, a decade-long civil war proved that diamonds were being smuggled to finance one side in the war. In the neighboring Liberia, timber was being exported illegally, and iron was also being used to sponsor the war. In Zimbabwe, the discovery of diamonds has led to the militarization of the Chiadzwa diamond fields and mass displacement of villagers without compensation. The activities are causing a lot of environmental harm. Looting of diamonds has been the order of the day. The country is not benefiting from the extraction of the diamonds. Instead, the villagers are crying foul. No compensation was given to them because they were displaced from their motherland. The diamond fields have been heavily militarized. There is no accountability on how the resources are being used. The Auditor General also proved that there's a lot of money that is coming from diamonds, but the money is not being accounted for. So that's a challenge. Instead of the citizens benefiting from the resources that are in their countries, those resources are actually proving to be a case. They are not benefiting from them. The environment is being degraded, and militarism is the order of the day. Next slide, please. It is also important to note that resources, next slide. It is also important to note that resources from Africa are being used for arms proliferation. For instance, the uranium that is being used for building nuclear weapons is coming from Africa. Uranium mining in Africa is the main resource base for atomic weapons and power plants throughout the world. Uranium for the Hiroshima bomb came from the Belgian Congo. 20% and 50% of the Western world's uranium came from African countries, namely Namibia, South Africa, Niger, Congo, Gabon, and Madagascar. In 2003, George Bush in his speech noted that uranium from Niger made Iraq nuclear. Niger did not have nuclear weapons. It does not possess nuclear weapons, but it produced uranium that is being used to build nuclear weapons. So while feeding the militarized political economies, uranium mining has also negative effects that are being felt in more than 30 African countries. Next slide. Nuclear testing has also contributed to security threats and tensioning of relations among the great powers. For instance, North Korea announced that it will carry out its 7th nuclear test in 2002, to which the US indicated that it will not take it lightly, since it is a complete violation of the UN Security Council resolution and would be destabilizing world security. In 2017, North Korea also did a series of weapons tests that prompted the then President Donald Trump to assert that any more threats to the United States will be met with fire and fury. So you notice how these great powers are being involved in nuclear testing, nuclear arms build up, and then you tend to wonder how much is really being used, you know, in destabilizing the world order. Well, this is evidence to show how nuclear tests are a threat toward peace and security. Nuclear tests are also contributing to major environmental impacts in most of the nuclear test sites. worldwide. Next slide, please. So you realize that the military industries are responsible for the climate crisis. The environmental degradation, nuclear tests are also proving to be having far-reaching consequences on the environment and the health of the people that are around the explosion areas. Militarism is also contributing to more greenhouse gas emissions and ecological degradation. Large quantities of toxic waste are being produced, but nothing is being done about it. Military spending is diverting massive funding from the global critical issues. Hence, you realize that there is a strong link between military industries, environmental degradation, conflicts that are happening around the world, and the climate crisis must not be ignored, because huge funds are being invested in militarism and less is being done in relation to climate adaptation. The climate crisis is also contributing to bloody, violent conflicts in most African countries over access of the few available resources, water scarcity, food insecurity. These issues are the order of the day in most African countries. So, as we have been armed with all this information on how militarism is contributing to climate crisis, how it is contributing to insecurity throughout, globally in Africa, in the European countries, as we approach COP27, let's amplify our voices on these key issues. Demilitarize to decarbonize. Let's stop the wars and cut the military spending for climate finance. Thank you all.
Edwick, that was just excellent, extremely informative. Thank you so much for making the connection between the looting of natural resources in Africa and the wars and armed conflict that we see, and those examples of the diamonds and uranium mining are really so important. And that is exactly the type of information that we need to have as we go into COP27, making those crucial links. And I'm so pleased now that we've got Jasmine Burnett on the call with us. Thank you so much for joining us. We are going to have Jasmine go next. She's going to present a little bit about the Black Alliance for Peace's month of action to shut down AFRICOM. Let me introduce Jasmine now. She is an Atlanta-based organizer with Community Movement Builders. She has led and supported campaigns to abolish the Atlanta Police Department, bring affordable fresh fruit and vegetables to Black residents, stop gentrification and displacement, and prevent additional housing for cops from being built in the community. Should be built for the people. Through CMB, Jasmine is also leveraging her experiences as a trained urban planner to bring more affordable housing and retail space for cooperative business to the Pittsburgh neighborhood. She's a member of Black Alliance for Peace and is involved in the Shutdown AFRICOM campaign. And I'll turn the floor over to her now. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be with you all today on behalf of BAP. For those who are not familiar, BAP is a collective of organizations and individuals that put together educational activities, organizing efforts, and support movements against US state repression, both domestically, but also globally. So really pushing and demanding the complete withdrawal of US forces from Africa, demilitarization of the continent, and the closure of US bases throughout the world so we can activate a pro-peace agenda. And for this month of action, specifically, we are fighting to shut down AFRICOM. So AFRICOM is one of the 11 US Department of Defense commands, so essentially military bases across the African continent, now with 44 different African nations who are participating. The US justified this program with a phrase around Africa being of strategic importance to the United States. but really we understand that AFRICOM's role is to foment extremism on the continent in order to justify the program's existence and to create an environment in which African nations are reliant upon the US military's presence. So it's an extension of imperialism and of neocolonialism. And this month of action is about really broadening an international movement against AFRICOM. So we kicked off this campaign at the beginning of October with an amazing webinar. We reached over 174 people, had some great panelists, and they all really talked about the ways in which, as I mentioned, AFRICOM is an extension of neocolonialism, just like the IMF, just like the World Bank, in this case, using military aid as a weapon against African sovereignty and self-determination. They also talked about the need for AFRICOM, getting rid of AFRICOM, getting US out of Africa, needing to be really a global struggle. It needs to be an international movement for us to win. And so that's really the impetus of this campaign that we have for this month and why we're asking folks to get involved. So for the second week of the campaign, we're encouraging people to host teach-ins in their communities, really educating folks about AFRICOM, how they can get involved in the fight against it, and why that fight is so necessary. It's important too to know that you can find any materials that you would need to participate on the website that's on the screen. There's a toolkit, there's a fact sheet. For organizations, there's even a way to officially endorse the month of action and have your name listed on those endorsements. There's also an AFRICOM bulletin. So if you're looking for just more information about how AFRICOM is truly connected to the fight for, against imperialism and against neocolonialism, that bulletin is a great resource. So moving into the third week, in the third week, we are encouraging folks to do very kind of mass and visible demonstrations. So that can be a banner drop, that can be a march or a rally, really just a way to bring even more people into this fight. And then the fourth week of October, we're suggesting just sharing educational materials about AFRICOM to your network, on social media. And again, all of that information, the toolkit, the fact sheet, can be found on the website that's on the screen. So it's really easy to just kind of plug and play those materials into whichever set of events that you want to participate in. So yeah, happy to be here with you all and looking forward to continue to build to get the US out of Africa.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. We so appreciate you being here with us, and we are absolutely in solidarity with Black Alliance for Peace, on this campaign to shut down AFRICOM. We are going to bring that message as well to Egypt, to COP27, because we know that it is impossible for the continent to adapt to the climate crisis, to alleviate poverty, to develop sustainably with the growing presence of AFRICOM and NATO. And we must be in solidarity with you to resist and to shut down AFRICOM. So thank you so much for joining us. So now we're going to turn it over to our final presenter today. And I'm so glad that we've got Mapiwa Mangawiro Tsazanga. She is our member from WILPF's South Africa group. She holds a Bachelor of Laws law degree and a Master's in Peace and Conflict Studies. Mapiwa is a trained lawyer and human rights advocate who is committed to advancing women's rights and gender equality. She is currently the Policy Development and Advocacy Manager for an international non-governmental organization in South Africa. Mapiwa has also worked with many women's rights organizations in the country, where she has held various portfolios from a researcher, legal advisor to advocacy specialist. She also has expertise as a consultant monitoring and in evaluating the implementation of various projects for gender equality and human rights. In August, Mapiwa was one of our speakers on our first webinar on the gender perspectives of climate change and solutions in her country of South Africa. Mapiwa is also on our WILPF delegation to COP27. Mapiwa, please take it away. Thanks.
Thank you. Afternoon, morning, evening, depending on where you are. I'm not sure if you can see me on video, but I hope you can. You can confirm that. So I'm going to pick up the conversation from where our other previous speakers have started, and I'm also looking at the impact of Western militarism on Africa and its ability to address climate change. And I think as a way of starting the conversation, I wanted to highlight the fact that while climate change is a global concern that is because of the adverse ecological and economic and humanitarian effects that it presents, the reality is that it affects different nations and different continents disproportionately. And while Africa has contributed negligibly to the changing climate, with just about 2 to 3% of global emissions, it stands out disproportionately as the most vulnerable region in the world. And this vulnerability is driven by several drivers, including the low levels of socioeconomic growth on the continent. And the reality is that Africa has vast mineral and natural resources, yet it is perpetually perceived and described as impoverished, backward, and underdeveloped. And that's because in most instances, these resources have not resulted in the improvement of citizens' well-being. And yet, in spite of that, labeling Africa, such labeling and description of Africa, while it is true that Africa has challenges, there is poverty, there is challenges with development, such framings are often devoid of some of the reasons behind what has often been referred to as the resource curse, and particularly the relationship with the Western world, which is, or the global north, if we may put it that way. And the relationship between Africa and the global West can in general be described as an exploitative one, in which Africa is treated as inferior, weak, with no right to exercise agency over its resources. I think the presentations that have spoken before have shown us how some of the imperialist policies around the globe are designed to set up Africa for failure, to ensure that Africa is not able to exercise full agency over its resources. Also, Africa is being incapable of developing itself, while the Western world is deemed as superior, advanced, and more developed and capable of better utilizing Africa's resources. And I think this is evidenced by the historical relationship between Africa and the West from the days of the slave trade, colonialism, modern day neo-imperialism, which is all designed to exploit the continent and its resources. We can move to the next slide. And the next. Yes, so the economic pillaging of African resources by Western powers affect European states during colonialism was perpetuated and was created and perpetuated through military forces. And the history of militarism of Africa by the West is best described by a quote by Walter Rodney in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, where he states that, needless to say, in the 1950s, when most Africans were still colonial subjects, they had absolutely no control over the utilization of their soil for militaristic ends. Virtually the whole of North Africa was turned into a sphere of operations for NATO, with bases aimed at the Soviet Union. They could have easily developed a nuclear war without African peoples having any knowledge of the matter. So we are coming from a history with the Western world in which our resources on the continent, our land was even used without the consent, without the knowledge of Africans in terms of how this, and then when we see the military activities that were happening on the continent were taking place without African agency, without African knowledge in some instances. And post the colonial era, while there was a period where there seemed to be less foreign interest in Africa's military standing and military resources because of the time that we're building our independence and all, this has changed, particularly post the September 9/11 attacks, when we have seen a lot of rhetoric increasing the language around preventing terrorism, stopping terrorist attacks, and this has resulted in a growing interest in Africa again. And we have seen that and this has also resulted, as a result of this growing interest in Africa in terms of supposedly partnering with Africa in terms of fighting terrorist attacks, preventing terrorist attacks, and etc. The continent has witnessed a rising number of foreign military bases, which, while also indicative of the gaps on the continent's responses to peace and security concerns, it is also a cause of concern in itself, as many African states are not in a position to fully monitor the movement of weapons from and to these bases. So it takes us back to that position where weapons can be exchanged, even nuclear weapons on our continent, and our leaders may not be fully aware of that. And also the presence of and reliance on foreign military bases comes at a high price for the continent. It causes asymmetry with external states dominating African security agenda, as these forces are there to protect the military needs of their countries and regions, and not those of Africans. In many instances, they also deprive host nations of their sovereignty. And also citizens of these countries lose the right to have governments of their choosing who can make decisions that benefit them instead of foreign entities, such as NATO partners. Often foreign partners, foreign powers turn a blind eye to dictators who align or are perpetuating key interests of the Western powers. An example was Mobutu Sese Seko from the Democratic Republic of Congo, who was one of the worst dictators that the country had ever experienced, but because he was aligning his interests to that of the Western world and always playing on their fear that communism in the country would be the worst for the continent, then they for a long time turned a blind eye to his ruthless dictatorship. Next slide. And of the countries with a non-presence in Africa, the US and France have the most troops on the continent, and from their outposts across Africa, foreign militaries focus primarily on protecting their interests, securing friendly regimes, protecting their influence, and rising competition among global powers. And I think currently we are experiencing this rising competition among global powers with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and efforts by the Western powers to get Africans to condemn this act. And we saw that the majority of absenteeisms from voting on the UN resolution came from African nations. That's indicating that there is a disjuncture between the Western foreign policy and that of Africans. And that is already creating a competition. We've seen engagements between Russia, China, US with Africa, and a number of conferences are supposed to be lined up in the last part of the year. And also NATO has become a huge global axle in the wheel of the military-industrial complex, which includes bases or relations with most African countries, which are controlled by NATO and the partners for purposes of full spectrum dominance, driven by the ferocious appetites of corporate capital. And in countries such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, military forces are used to exploit the natural resources of the country without accountability. In 1996, for instance, some 6 million people were killed when Western proxies invaded the country to ensure their uninterrupted plunder of Africa's strategic raw materials, such as cobalt, chromium, coltan, uranium, all those that have already been mentioned by some of my colleagues before. And these minerals are strategically important, not just for cell phones, but also for the technologies that drive the military industrial complex. And already, as has been alluded to, resource extraction is deeply violent and a brutal process as it disposes people of their land and forests. Force is used to control local communities. For instance, in Uganda, oil fields are heavily militarized, with the military working in tandem with mine securities to control movement and activities of our local communities. Also, in the example that was alluded to earlier in Zimbabwe, in the Marange diamond fields, more than 200 women, artisanal miners and residents were subjected to gang rapes during the 2008 military operation, which cleared a path for the military to assume control. More than 200 miners were killed by the military during these operations. And in 2011, the BBC exposed a torture camp where miners and community residents were tortured and sexual abuse of women was widespread. So that's already also showing the gendered impact of militarism and the extractive industries. And so resource extraction also pollutes water, air, soil. Artisanal miners and industrial workers endure dangerous and violent working conditions. Next slide. So as I've mentioned, militarism sits really hand in glove with the extractive industries, which stand to profit from the political connections to elected politicians, the military and the national elite. And also militarization ferments deeply entrenched violence against workers, violence in communities, and violence against women. And as we are still speaking about militarization, in 2007, 2008, the US established AFRICOM, which whose purpose was allegedly to assist African states by strengthening military cooperation and therefore enhancing security. However, AFRICOM was initially met with resistance as African leaders treated it with suspicion and viewed it as US intention to increase its military presence to exploit the continent for its benefit. And however, in spite of the claims that these foreign bases and strategies are there to train and assist Africa to strengthen its peace and security threats, not much has changed in the continent. In fact, as a result of the presence of some of these foreign powers and the NATO interventions in countries such as Libya, this has left behind some of the worst destruction and human rights violations. As has been explained before, in Libya, international law was violated as NATO forces launched a bombing campaign that killed thousands of civilians and caused tens of billions of property and infrastructure damage. And this was one country on the continent that economically was doing very well. And in the aftermath of that has been left insecurity, has been left a lot of destruction. And also, as a result of this, terrorist violence has increased on the continent, resulting in civilian casualties and instabilities, which the West has used as a pretext and justification for the continued need of Western involvement in affairs of Africa and for the continued presence of NATO, AFRICOM, etc. And these also continue to rely on their neo-colonial African proxies to fight wars on, such as in DRC, where wars are being fought for the exploitation of our resources and throughout other parts of Africa, which are of strategic interest to these Western powers. Next. So the impact of militarism really is militarism is a complex social and cultural phenomenon, which is rooted in the tradition of the use of violence for the resolution of conflicts. And while conflicts are a common phenomenon in human existence, militarism stands for the upkeep of military forces trained to use extreme violence and destruction. And in armed conflicts, the targets of extreme violence are generally unknown. So which adds to the cold-bloodedness or inhumanity of this type of direct violence, because there is no connection with the targets of such violence. And also it is embedded in our everyday lives in war and in peacetime. Militarism is entrenched in cultural beliefs, in language, and notions like patriotism, identity, morality. It's hidden in power structures that make us accept militarism, as well as in open practices like weapon toys, camouflage clothing, or media entertainment. So it's something that is really been deeply entrenched in our day-to-day living. And it is a serious threat to peace and security, and it exacerbates climate change because it is accompanied by many forms of violence, like ecological violence, predatory industries, cultural violence, and structural violence, which is aimed at weakening economic systems to erode adversary bases of existence. I'll not get into detail because my colleagues have also explained some of the damage that comes with militarism in terms of environmentally. And military operations leave a toxic legacy in their work as they despoil the landscape, pollute the soil, and contaminate drinking water. And so the increase of Western military bases in Africa continues to exacerbate the destruction to the environment and cumulatively they accelerate the effects of climate change, which African governments are unfortunately not well equipped to deal with as they lack the adequate resources. Next slide. And it is also worth noting that some of the biggest suppliers worldwide of arms deals, and this was statistics that was pulled out from 20 back then, around 10 years ago, which was showing there the US, Russia, France, UK, Germany, Italy, is some of the leading countries when it comes to arms deals. And most of these sales are targeted to or are made with developing countries, including Africa. And Africa has witnessed an increase in demand for arms. And what is also worth noting is that 4 of the biggest arms suppliers are at the same time part of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. And one might wonder how this relationship came to be and what implications it has for militarism and global arms trade. Next slide, please. So I think as we go to COP27, having painted the picture and showed how militarism is really affecting Africa, how all the extractive activities are also having a negative impact on Africa, I think as some of the calls should be for the demilitarization of the African continent by superpowers. It should be accountability to environmental damage and degradation caused by militarism across the continent. It should also be accountability of Western proxies and multinational corporations in the extractive industries who are causing environmental degradation. And also, Western powers should commit to and avail resources for developing countries to effectively mitigate the effects of climate change, less budgeting towards military spending and more towards mitigating the effects of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mapiwa, for that comprehensive and powerful presentation. I really appreciate you mentioning Walter Rodney's seminal book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And it reminds me of what Michael Parenti, the American political scientist, once said: African countries are not poor and underdeveloped, they are overexploited. And you reminded us that in order for us to engage effectively in our climate activism, we must center the problem and the violence of militarism. And I also noticed that your calls for COP27 echo and buttress the ones that Edwick presented as well. So just excellent. Thank you so much. So it looks like we have a good 15 minutes for a question and answer period. I have a couple of questions that I have received, but I see that we have a hand up in the audience. It looks like Michael Goodman would like to make a comment and ask a question. So Michael, I believe that our tech people are going to let you unmute and share your question.
Hello.
Please go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, hello. I think this may have been a mistake. I wasn't intending to speak live, but as long as you've asked me to, I did have a question or concern. Wondering if you could say something about what I think was a similar role that was played by the Soviet Union as far as intervention goes. For example, in Ethiopia during the period of the Derg under Mengistu Mariam, and also the situation in Angola, where it's my understanding that the Cubans were virtually running the country during the 70s. And then the second part of my question, which I think someone also raised in the chat, is what about the role of China in Africa? And don't you see similarities there with what the US is also being critiqued for? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that. And I'm going to let Abayomi answer those questions. And I just as he's unmuting, I would like to remind the audience that in my presentation, I showed the slide of US AFRICOM. I encourage people to really check out and explore that website, showing that the United States has been bombing the country for years and years, and we don't see China doing the same, bombing the country. They seem to be building more and not bombing, but I'll let Abayomi answer that question. I know that he has a lot to say about that. Abayomi?
Oh, thank you. In regard to the former Soviet Union's involvement in Ethiopia, they did politically support and economically support the Mengistu government, which began as the Derg and later transformed itself into the Workers' Party of Ethiopia. But in terms of direct military intervention, it did not occur. Cuba did intervene militarily in 1978 to beat back an invasion which had been instigated by the US from the Somalian government at that time of Siad Barre. It was a counter-revolutionary intervention to try to break off the Ogaden region so it would become a part of Somalia. But this was instigated by the Carter administration. In regard to China, China historically has been supportive of African independence struggles, the progressive and socialist-oriented governments on the continent, and even those which have more of a moderate and conservative position. We have not seen direct Chinese military interventions on the African continent. They do have a small presence outside of Djibouti, but in comparison militarily to the presence of Pentagon forces there on behalf of AFRICOM, and also French Foreign Legion forces at Camp Lemonet, it pales in comparison. So from my viewpoint, I do not see a parallel between Soviet and Chinese interventions and engagements in Africa with historic colonialism and imperialist militarism fostered by the United States, France, Britain, and NATO all across the African continent. And just concluding, I just wanted to make a remark in regard to the threat of nuclear war. We have to remind ourselves that the only country in the world that has ever utilized an atomic weapon and against civilians is the United States in 1945. They dropped 2 bombs on Japan. They have also used depleted uranium weapons in attacks in Iraq and in the former Yugoslavia, as well as Afghanistan and in Libya during 2011, which has caused immense environmental and public health damage. I would shudder to think of a world since 1945, the last 77 years, where the United States maintained total dominance and a monopoly on nuclear weaponry. I think the world would be much worse off in regard to the threat of imperialism and militarism.
Thank you very much for that, Abayomi. And I'm going to check with Mapiwa and with Edwick to see if either of them would like to respond to China and Russia on the African continent, I am aware of the fact that Russia has exported weapons to Africa, different African countries. Africa is, Russia, the Russian Federation is going to be having at the end of the year a meeting with African leaders. They had a very successful one a couple of years ago. So let me check with Mapiwa and Edwick if either of them would like to add to what Abayomi has just said. Mapiwa, please go ahead.
Thanks, Tamara. Yes, to say that while in terms of economic relations, there is some issues around the nature of how China and Russia sometimes engage with Africa in terms of the nature of the loans and the agreements and the repayment and the implications and so forth, which can also be argued to be to be imperialistic in nature. When it comes to militarism, these have been allies for Africa. If, for instance, as has been said, China has never bombed Africa. Russia, in the struggle for liberation for many African countries, Russia was provided arms and support, which is actually why, as we are witnessing the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a number of African countries have not taken a stand to support the Western narrative or to condemn Russia in terms of sanctions and so forth, because there is this understanding that Russia is an ally. Russia is there to support from military perspective and has never colonized Africa, as it were, because also embedded on this issue is the relationship of colonialism that has existed between Africa and the West.
Thank you very much, Mapiwa. And let me go to Edwick now.
Okay, thank you so much, Tamara. Basically, I'll focus on the Chinese and the extractive industry, especially in Zimbabwe. Of late, we've been having so many cases of human rights abuses of these Chinese investors. And then we're also having the criminalization of the environmental activists who actually confront the Chinese and what they are doing on the environment, and especially to the villagers. In most cases, we've been having issues to do with displacements, and even the issue of Chiadzwa, the Chiadzwa diamond fields that I was talking about. You realize that the Chinese investment companies are on the forefront of the extractive industries. And almost 90% of the Chinese investors in Zimbabwe that are taking part in the extractive industries, the local population are not benefiting. If you are to work for the Chinese, you are not paid in time. Most of the cases are going to labor courts, but nothing is being done when it comes to the Chinese. So yes, the relationship between Chinese and Africans, in as much as it may seem that the Chinese are helping Africans in courts, you can look at even the loans that they are giving to African governments and the repayment terms. So you realize that the relationship is exploiting in nature. It's not, beneficiary for both parties. And when you look at the environmental degradation, how African countries are not benefiting from the resources in their countries at the expense of the Chinese investors. So yes, I think maybe there is we are just used to talking about the West. More focus is being on the West, and less focus is being put on the East, whereas the East is also contributing to the exploitation that is happening in the African countries. And you can also talk about corruption, the lack of accountability, lack of transparency. You see that the Chinese investors are in the middle of all those issues that we talk about. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Edwick. I see that we have Aubin, who is a WILPF member from Cameroon. She's a French speaker, and she's made a comment in the chat, but I wanted to see if Aubin would like to share her comments with us all. And I'm just going to wait for a moment to see if she is able to unmute and share her points with us. Aubin, s'il vous plaît.
Good
Oh, we
evening,
can't.
everyone.
Sorry. Please go ahead, Obin, a little bit louder. Thank you.
Bonsoir, bonsoir à tous. Oui, je sais, je suis en train de parler.
Okay.
Allô? Vous m'écoutez?
Yes, hello.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Je disais bonsoir.
Thank you so much. I was saying good evening, everyone. And thank you to Tamara for this great moderation. And thank you to everybody who was who presented, and my African sisters as well. Those were speaking about different realities that are common in every African country. And as I was saying in my little comment, and especially when we're speaking about those extracting mine, you know, and you find that you have a lot of people, they are literally reaping, and they are reaping our resources, and human right is not respected in terms of remuneration. But we are seeing that there are decisions that are taken and there are decisions which are taken against us, and you see when women are rising up to speak, and women are given into prostitution, and which is bringing a lot of sicknesses. And when women are giving themselves into prostitution, they do that because of poverty. And if they need to give themselves again into to give themselves into those different activities that will expose them into sicknesses, and there is a real impact in everybody's life. So I was so touched by the presentation, which was insisting much on which was speaking about the extraction of our resources. This is a problem which is real in Cameroon, for example. In East, we are seeing premature childbearing and sicknesses, which is really impacting. I have a difficulty to hear her, sorry.
Obin, un peu plus fort et un peu plus lentement, s'il vous plaît, merci.
Vous me suivez, vous m'avez entendu?
Oui, ça va.
Oui.
Allez-y.
Ok, oui, Tamara, je disais que...
Yes, Tamara, as I was saying that I was so touched by the presentation, which was insisting on the extraction of mine in African country by the Occident, by the West. As I said, that during those extraction, there we have a lot of phenomena that are taking place, which seems to be developing itself around us. We have different economic activities which are being done by young girls who are giving themselves into prostitution, because they think that those workers who are already being exploited in terms of human right by the West, who are coming for extraction of our mines, they are giving themselves into prostitution as well. And we know the result of prostitution is that they're bringing sicknesses which are going, and we have a premature childbirth, which is coming again to add itself into their situation. And already we have this phenomenon of a climate change, which has a great impact in the population. And as we presented, presented the other time, with it has an impact in agriculture, which is reducing. And we have this phenomenon where women need to give themselves again into that form of prostitution. And that one is also a problem which is coming to add itself in an existing problem already. So that's why I was saying that this presentation really touched me, because it's a phenomenon which is so real in Cameroon, especially in the East region, during the extraction of mine. When do you have a company which is coming to extract our riches, prostitution is giving, people are given into prostitution. So it is very important to find a way during those extraction. As for us African, personally, we need to be aware. We need to be able to develop our technology to see how we'll be able to transform our resources so that the West wouldn't only come and start to rob our nation, but to be able to find that different activities can be done around that extraction. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much, Obin, for making that connection between militarism, extractivism, and violence against women. And I'm so pleased that you're going to be on our delegation to COP27 in Egypt. Now we're going to close our webinar. I'm going to give just 1 minute to each of our panelists to very quickly give final remarks, and we will close in the next 5 minutes. So in reverse order, we'll first have Mapiwa give her 1 minute closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. As we close, I think critically the key message that we need to take to COP27 is that it is time to demilitarize. It is time to demilitarize on African soil. It is time to demilitarize everywhere. We cannot be talking about mitigating climate change. We cannot be talking about climate justice when we are still having this massive militarization that is happening across the globe, in particular on the African continent, when we're experiencing these large, huge emissions that are happening as a result of this militarization. So it's time that we are talking, and it's time that we really consider, it's time for feminist peace leadership to take the lead as we find solutions to climate change. Thank you.
Well said. So powerful and important. Edwick, please, your closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamara. Firstly, I would like to say that as African feminists, we want the provision of adequate, accessible, and human rights-centered climate finance as a matter of justice and equity. We also want increased transparency and accountability for the pledged and delivered public funding in developed countries. So basically, this is what we want for COP27. And as African countries, even for those countries that are not in Africa, let's continue advocating and lobbying for disarmament. Let's make sure that our countries, they abide by the disarmament treaties at national and international platforms. They should walk the talk instead of just having treaties that are not binding and that our countries are not following too. Thank you.
Very well said. Those are the messages that we'll be taking to COP27. And Abayome, our final presenter, for your closing remarks.
Well, thank you, and for the invitation to participate in this webinar. Those of us who live in the Western countries, I believe, have a greater responsibility to fight against militarism, which is closely connected to imperialist world relations. I think that the question of the United States being the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions has been documented in several studies that have taken place over the last several years. We believe that our focus should be on the United States, since historically they have been the greatest threat and maintain the greatest threats to world peace. If we look at Eastern Europe, if we look at the China Seas, if we look at what's going on all across Africa, we will clearly see the role of Washington through the Pentagon and NATO as being a major source of political and economic instability.
Thanks so much for that, Abayomi. And so in closing, friends, I would like to thank our panelists for their informative and important presentations that will equip us as we do our climate activism in the lead up to COP27. I also want to thank our tech people behind the scenes and our interpreters. Thank you very much. And I also want to extend my gratitude to all of you for joining our webinar today. Please make these connections. Please help center militarism in the climate crisis. Please join us in our call for demilitarization, for decarbonization and decolonization. And I wanted to let you know that this webinar is going to turn into a briefing document that we're going to take to COP27. I want to encourage you to participate in this month of action to shut down AFRICOM. And I want to encourage you to follow our delegation when we're in Egypt next month. And finally, get involved in WILPF International. You're welcome to join our environmental working group. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and help us bring climate peace and climate justice together. So we hope that you will join us again soon. And thank you so much for coming, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Merci.